Hello everyone, this is My Two Cents, and today I would like to talk broadly about the discussion about whether or not God exists. This is a topic that I enjoy discussing very much. For the record, I do believe in God. That being said, I do have a great deal of respect for a number of people that don't. I follow a number of YouTube channels that are run by atheists. Just because I disagree with those people on whether or not God exists doesn't mean I can't appreciate the work they put forward with which I do agree. But this video specifically I'm making in response to a video that was made by a YouTube channel called Deflating Atheism about the claim made by atheists that there is no evidence that God exists. I will put a link to that in the description. And I made a comment on the video. A number of people commented on my comment, and it just compelled me to want to put out a few of my thoughts about this issue. So, now, as I said, I do believe in God. I am prepared to explain why, although that's not the purpose of this video. And I know that there are intelligent people who do not believe in God, and they're also prepared to explain why. And I think I enjoy having discussions with people about that. I just would like to say that I think rhetoric, like saying when people say there is no evidence for God, or conversely, if people say there is so much evidence for God, only an idiot could be an atheist, I think rhetoric like that is unhelpful in these types of discussions, and I would like to explain why. So to illustrate this, I'd like you to consider the following two statements. One is made by a theist, and one is made by an atheist. The theist says, "There is no evidence that God does not exist. The only reason that anyone disbelieves in God is because they don't want God to exist. They'd rather live their life as they please, not morally accountable to God." Conversely, the atheist says, "There is no evidence that God exists. The only reason that anyone believes in God is because they don't like the idea of there being no life after death. They cling to the idea of God because it gives them comfort and hope that they will live forever in heaven." Now, I want to point out these are both assertions being made by the theist and the atheist. So I would say both the people who are going to make these assertions bear a burden of proof to defend that the assertion they're making is actually true. However, I think statements like this are both unhelpful in conversations about whether or not God exists, because in principle, at least in principle, both these statements could be absolutely true. It could absolutely be true that there are some atheists that choose not to believe in God because they do not want to be morally accountable to God. It is absolutely true that there could be theists who only choose to believe in God because they are uncomfortable with there being no life after death, and they want there to be eternal life in heaven. Both those claims could be true of some people. However, both of these claims, even if true, don't actually tell us anything about whether or not the theist or the atheist is correct. To know whether or not God exists, you're going to have to put forward a rational argument, either that God exists or that God does not exist. So let's consider two arguments, one that classic argument made by a theist and a classic argument made by an atheist. So first, a classic argument that has been made by theists, the contingency argument for God. It goes like this. Premise 1, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Premise 2, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. Premise 3, the universe exists. Conclusion, given 1 and 2, the explanation of the universe's existence is God. Now, I'd like to point out this is a logically valid argument. In other words, if the premises are true, then the conclusion follows necessarily. However, that does not necessarily mean that the conclusion is true. If the person making this argument, though it is a logically valid argument, the burden of proof is now on the person making the argument to actually demonstrate that the premises are true. And that's a discussion that can be had, but nonetheless, it is a logically valid argument that people could bring forward to defend the existence of God. Now let's consider a classic argument made by atheists. Okay, perhaps the most popular objection to God's existence there is. It takes many various forms, but here's just a basic form of the problem of evil. Premise 1, if God exists, gratuitous evil does not exist. Premise 2, gratuitous evil exists. Conclusion, therefore God does not exist. Once again, a logically valid argument. If the premises are true, then the conclusion follows necessarily. So now the burden of proof is on the person making this argument to demonstrate the actual truthfulness of premises 1 and 2. Now, as I said, the purpose of this video was not to defend or refute either of those arguments. It was just to point out that there are logically valid arguments that can be made on both sides of the issue, and the burden of proof is on the person making the argument to demonstrate that the premises of the argument are true. Now, let's go back to the statements that were made at the beginning of this video. Now, considering both of these statements, like I said, in principle, both these statements could be true, and they could, in fact, apply to theists and atheists alike. However, neither of these statements, even if true, actually affects whether or not either of the previous arguments that we just discussed are true or untrue, or valid or invalid. Both these statements could be true. It doesn't actually affect the arguments people are making. So that's why I think that in these kinds of discussions, rhetoric like saying there's no evidence that God exists, anyone who believes in God is an idiot, or there's so much evidence that God exists, anyone who's an atheist is an idiot. Those kind of statements are just unhelpful. If you want to have a discussion about whether or not God exists, put forward your reasons as to why he does or does not exist, and then from there we can have a discussion. Now, that's not to say I don't think there's any value in discussing why people believe what they do. I think those are discussions worth having, but it was C.S. Lewis who said I'm paraphrasing, but something to the effect of, we must first show that a man is wrong before we start explaining why he is wrong. So anyways, I just make this video to say I think statements like there's no evidence that God exists, or there's tons of evidence that God exists, those statements are just generally speaking unhelpful in this discussion. If you believe God exists, put forward your reasons. If you don't believe God exists, put forward your reasons, and then from there we can have a discussion. So anyways, that's my 2 cents. Take it for what it's worth.